Decisions under uncertainty are one of the most vexing parts of the climate change debate. Should we listen to the 97% of scientists representing the mainstream view of climate science, or the 3% of scientific outliers? After all, the outliers may be right. Let's begin with a few points that are obvious but nonetheless worth explicitly stating. First off, if 97% of the experts agree on something, then it's probably correct. So conclusions that the Earth is warming, humans are very likely responsible for most of the recent warming, and the future warming may be severe, are very likely to be correct. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that those statements are correct. And so let's investigate some decision making under uncertainty and see how we handle uncertainty in other venues. Let's begin with a jury trial under the U.S. criminal trial system and ask the question, what's the standard for convicting someone of a crime and sending them to prison? So anyone who's ever watched an episode of Law & Order, which I think is probably everybody, knows that the standard is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And what that basically means is you have to be very sure the person is guilty before you convict them. Now, you don't have to be 100% certain. There can be some uncertainty, but there cannot be a lot of uncertainty. And the question you need to ask yourself is, why is this our standard? We could have picked something else. We could have picked preponderance of evidence. We also could have picked any evidence of guilt being sufficient to convict someone. But yet we chose this as being our standard. And the question is why? And the answer comes from examining the potential errors that we can make. So there are two errors a jury can make. They can convict an innocent person, or they can acquit a guilty person. And we have decided as a society that convicting an innocent person is the worst mistake. So we bias the decision-making process to make that the least likely outcome. So by requiring juries to only convict people that they are almost certain committed the crime, they reduce the chance that they're going to convict an innocent person. Now, on the other hand, they accept an increased chance that they'll acquit a guilty person, but that's okay. We've made a decision that that's the better outcome for society. So let's look at another example. Should we take action to head off a potential terrorist threat? So there's a great quote from Dick Cheney. If there was even a 1% chance of terrorists getting a weapon of mass destruction, the United States must now act as if it were a certainty. So what Cheney's saying here is that if there's a shred of evidence that this is true, then we have to take action. And we should compare that to the jury trial. It's really very different. In a jury trial, you only take action when you're certain. On Twitter, someone came up with the scenario, you're about to get on a plane, and 97% of the mechanics or the experts say the flight is safe. 3% say the plane is going to crash. So what do you do? Well, again, let's look at the possible errors that we can make. All right, one error is that you needlessly delay a flight for a plane that's fine to fly. The other error is that you don't delay the flight and the plane crashes. And so you ask yourself the question, which of these is worse? And obviously, the plane crashing is the worst outcome. Flights get delayed all the time. It's not that big a deal. In this case, I would bias my decision towards listening to the dissonant voices. So in this case, I am not getting on the plane. And I would advise them delaying the flight until all the experts agree because of the potential errors. So let's look at climate change. So we have really two choices for climate change. One is we could use the jury standard. We have to be certain that climate change is going to be catastrophic before we take action to head it off. The other is sort of the Cheney standard, which is even if there's a small chance of catastrophic harm occurring, we must act now as if it were a certainty. And so how do we evaluate these? Well, again, we go back to what we've done before. We look at the potential errors. So there are, again, two potential errors. We could switch renewable energy, do the other things, and it turns out that climate change is not all that serious. That's one error we can make. The other error is we don't take action and climate change turns out to be severe. So which of these two errors is worse? There are several reasons to think that switching to renewable energy, even if climate change turns out to not be a very serious problem, is not a terribly bad action. There are co-benefits such as cleaner air and political benefits of not using fossil fuels. In addition, it's a reversible decision. If we choose not to burn coal now, we can always burn it later. And finally, it's inevitable. We're going to run out of fossil fuel, and we're going to have to make this switch. And in general, the earlier you start making these changes, the cheaper they are. And so starting now has that advantage. It's also worth pointing out that climate change is at a very fundamental level irreversible. Every cubic kilometer of ice we lose, every centimeter of sea level rise that occurs, those are not going to be reversed on any time scale that we care about. Those are irreversible changes as far as I'm concerned. And irreversibility means you have to be very certain of the costs and benefits before you take an irreversible action. And so when you put all of this together, it seems very clear to me that the worst error is not taking action on climate change and having it turn out to be severe. And I think that if you want to argue that we should listen to the 3% of dissident scientists, then you have to make the argument that that's not the case, that switching to renewable energy is the worst mistake you can make. I think that's an extremely difficult argument to make. So I think if you put all of this together, it's very clear that we really should be listening to the 97% of scientists.